And so life continued, with Jesus at the centre of their thoughts, whether he was around or not. Tammie heard him teach many more mind-blowing things, and saw lots more too. But I can't tell you about them all here. John said, many, many years later, that if you wrote down all the amazing things that Jesus did, the whole world would not have room for the books. And John should know. It was coming round to Pesach or Passover, the most important time of the year. Tammie was getting excited, though being very grown up by now. 14, last birthday. Whoop-de-diddly-doo-ya. She pretended to be cool about it. Everyone who saw her these days said how ladylike she was looking, although it was a constant source of annoyance that she seemed to have stopped growing and Dibs, who was shooting up, was about to overtake her. The way Dibs behaved, nobody would ever mistake her for a lady, so that was some consolation. No amount of coolness would stop Tammie showing how thrilled she was that Jesus and his fellow travellers were back, so she, Dibs and Daniel slipped down to the beach as soon as they heard the news. They knew it would only be a flying visit, as all men had a duty to go to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. The three friends were determined to make the most of this stopover, however short. The situation that greeted them was not quite what they expected. Jesus was dozing in the sun outside Simon Peter's house, so they didn't disturb him, and Peter himself was standing at the water's edge with a fishing line, surrounded by a group of the others, watching with curiosity. It did look a bit odd, a professional fisherman standing patiently, waiting to catch one fish at a time. "What you doing?" said Dibs, blunt as ever. Peter bit his lip, annoyed that the little crowd of onlookers had grown. He clearly felt rather stupid. "He's paying his temple tax," said John, trying not to laugh. "And for Jesus too." "Really?" said Daniel. "That's 2 drachmas each. It'll take you ages to raise that with just a line, Peter. Would you like to borrow a net?" "Look, I'm doing what Jesus said, okay?" said Peter, swinging round to glare at them all. "Leave me be." Okay, his friends murmured soothingly, but they carried on watching just the same. There was a tug on the line. Simon Peter hauled it in, ignoring a smattering of sarcastic applause from Thomas and Matthew, intently watching the silver flick of the fish in the waves. He grabbed and dispatched it as soon as it came close, and then, "What's that in its mouth?" gasped Tammie, catching a glimpse of silver more pure than any fish. "It's a coin," breathed Andrew as Peter slid it out. "It's a 4-drachma coin," said Matthew with a very wry smile, aware that the joke was now firmly on them. Peter turned in triumph to Jesus, suddenly wide awake, and brandished the coin, running up the beach to him. The two went off together, leaving the others as the ones looking stupid. "I'll just," mumbled Andrew, indicating the discarded fish. "Dinner." He took it into the house, and the rest dispersed sheepishly. Tammie and her friends stuck with John to catch up on all that had been going on. Hanging out with him all afternoon meant that they were automatically included in the group when Jesus and some of his close followers gathered for dinner. Tammie and Daniel wondered if they ought to leave the adults to it, but old Sarah gestured to them to make themselves comfortable. They sat next to Dibs, who was already gripping a large bowl of chunky, coin-in-mouth fish soup, willing Jesus to give thanks for the food like a sprinter poised on the starting blocks. As they ate, Simon Peter couldn't resist gloating at those who had been mocking him earlier. "Tell me, Lord," he said, "how often should I forgive a brother if they do me wrong?" The disciples who had been involved in the great fish controversy, Fishgate if you prefer, rolled their eyes, wondering if he'd ever let them forget it. "As many as 7 times, perhaps?" Peter pressed. "Blimey, that's a lot," whispered Dibs through a slurp of soup. 70 times 7, said Jesus, also guzzling down his bowlful. They all stopped, amazed. 490, murmured Matthew, the ex-tax collector still extremely good at maths. But it wasn't the mental arithmetic that had halted them. It was the idea of having to forgive somebody more times than you could ever keep track of. Tammie and Daniel stared at each other. That would be a heap of Sabbath tunics. "Don't believe me?" asked Jesus. "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle his financial accounts. So, one by one, he called in each of his servants who owed him money." And so they were into another story, broken only as Jesus stopped to gulp another mouthful of soup or mop it up with his bread. There was this servant who owed the king millions, which he couldn't possibly pay, but the king was kind to him and wiped out the entire debt. But then the servant collared another who owed him a few thousand and threw him in jail. The king was not happy, and it didn't end well for that first servant. It wasn't a comfortable story. A few thousand was a lot of money. I mean, surely the servant had a right to go after it. But he'd been let off millions. Was that really how God saw the wrongs we might do each other compared to the debt we owed him? How could we ever repay that much by working hard? Tammie made a mental note to try to forgive people pretty speedily. Jesus smiled at her as he put down his bowl. If Jesus was God's son, did that mean God was a bit like him? If so, Tammie hoped she might be all right. Certainly she felt that if Jesus would only come with her, she could be brave enough to stand in front of the king when it was her turn, like in the story. And with that encouraging thought, she was able to enjoy a long and lazy evening, being one of the closest followers to Jesus for hours on end, until the moon was high in the sky to light her way home. The very next day, Jesus set off with his group, determined to get to Jerusalem early for Passover.